Dawn, March 10, 1945. The humid air of the Philippines clung to the rusting barbed wire of Santo Tomas Internment Camp, its twisted coils wet with tropical rain. Inside, shadows of women, gaunt, exhausted, but unbroken, stood at attention as they had been ordered so many times before. For over 3 years, they had lived beneath the harsh gaze of Imperial Japanese guards. Hunger gnawed at their bones. Disease spread silently in the cramped barracks. Hope, like the last sputtering flame of a candle, threatened to vanish with each passing day. But on this morning, something was different. Something was coming. The sound reached them first, low, heavy, and rhythmic. Boots. Marching boots. Not the light sandals of Japanese infantry, not the harsh bark of orders in clipped Tokyo syllables. These were deeper, heavier, thunderous boots that belonged to men carrying the weight of another world. U.S. Army After Action Report, March 1945. The women looked toward the gates. Soldiers approached, rifles slung, helmets gleaming wet with rain. And in that moment, the prisoners gasped, not from fear, but from disbelief. These men were tall and broad-shouldered, their uniforms impossibly clean compared to the filth of the camp. Their faces were young, resolute, and almost alien in their sheer health and confidence. They were Americans, yet in the eyes of the starved women, they looked like something more. They looked like giants. Bundesarchiv, Allied Interrogation Notes, 1945. For the Japanese guards, the appearance of these soldiers was just as shocking. For years, propaganda had painted the Americans as weak, decadent, and incapable of endurance in Asia's harsh jungles. Yet now, before their very eyes, came proof of the opposite. Soldiers hardened by campaigns in New Guinea, Leyte, and Luzon. Soldiers who carried more than rifles. They carried the full might of American industry. The endless logistics of convoys stretching across the Pacific, and the morale of a nation determined to bring every captive home. Imperial Japanese Army Officer Debrief, 1946. The story of that moment, the collision of two worlds at the gates of the camp, was more than a scene of liberation. It was a testament to the scale of the Pacific War. By early 1945, the United States had become an unstoppable tide rolling westward. Over 1.7 million American soldiers, sailors, and Marines operated across the Pacific. They commanded 7,000 ships, 13,000 aircraft, and the support of countless civilian workers back home, forging everything from Liberty ships in Portland to M1 rifles in Springfield. U.S. War Department Statistical Review, 1946. Against them, the Japanese Empire, stretched thin across thousands of miles, fought with dwindling supplies, starved garrisons, and outdated equipment. Yet even in their weakness, they retained ruthless control of camps where Allied prisoners, men and women alike, were reduced to shadows of themselves. The women of Santo Tomas were not combatants. They had been nurses, missionaries, teachers, and wives. Caught in Manila when the Japanese invaded in December 1941, rounded up, stripped of freedom, they had endured hunger so severe that a bowl of thin rice gruel became the highlight of the day. Some wasted away entirely. Others clung to life by stubborn will. Diseases like dysentery and beriberi claimed many before the war's end. And yet, as records later showed, they organized schools for children, sang hymns in the dark, and recorded their ordeal secretly so the world would one day know. Civilian Internment Diary, Philippines, 1942 to 1945. What the Japanese could not comprehend was the endurance of both prisoner and liberator. American forces, arriving in the Philippines after months of brutal campaigning, represented the full inversion of Japanese expectations. To the guards, they were supposed to be soft, demoralized, and incapable of jungle war. Instead, they were robust, heavily armed, and supplied by a machine of war that never seemed to falter. To the prisoners, they were not just rescuers. They were symbols of a world beyond the wire, a world they had almost forgotten existed. The sight of healthy men, with fresh uniforms and clear eyes, was enough to shock tears from women who had long ago learned not to cry. U.S. Army Medical Corps Report, 1945. The broader context of March 1945 reveals why this encounter carried such weight. The Philippines campaign, launched with the massive amphibious landings on Leyte in October 1944, had become a grinding liberation of islands, towns, and cities under Japanese occupation. General Douglas MacArthur, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return," commanded hundreds of thousands of troops in a drive to cut off Japan from its southern resources. Battles raged across Luzon, where Manila became the site of one of the bloodiest urban fights of the Pacific Theater. Over 100,000 civilians died in the destruction of the city, many massacred by retreating Japanese forces. MacArthur Military History Series, Volume 4. In this vast canvas of war, the camps stood as forgotten islands of suffering. They were not military targets, yet liberating them became a moral imperative. American soldiers knew that time was against the prisoners. Starvation and disease killed as surely as bullets. The mission to reach Santo Tomas and other camps was as urgent as capturing airfields or ports. For the soldiers storming the gates, the objective was not only tactical, it was human. U.S. Army 37th Infantry Division Report, 1945. Numbers underscore the scale of this struggle. By 1945, Japan held over 130,000 Allied POWs across its empire, along with tens of thousands of civilian internees. In the Philippines alone, camps like Santo Tomas, Los Baños, and Barbed became notorious for their conditions. Liberation meant more than victory on a map. It meant restoring humanity to those whom war had tried to erase. International Red Cross Report, 1946. The shock that rippled through Santo Tomas that morning was therefore more than personal. It symbolized the collision of perception and reality in the Pacific War. The Japanese guards, stripped of power, faced armed men they had once dismissed as incapable. The women prisoners, long reduced to silence, saw proof that the world had not forgotten them. And the American soldiers, hardened by fire and blood, glimpsed the very reason for their sacrifice. Not territory, not glory, but the lives of their fellow citizens. U.S. Army Chaplain's Diary, March 1945. And yet, this was only the beginning of the revelation. For the shock that the prisoners felt at the sight of the American soldiers would soon deepen. They had expected men, but what they saw seemed almost impossible. Soldiers supplied, equipped, and sustained by technologies and innovations beyond anything their captors could imagine. Radios crackled with orders from miles away. Trucks unloaded rations and medicine in quantities the women could scarcely comprehend. The Americans, it seemed, had marched not only with rifles, but with an entire civilization of war at their backs. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The story of what gave those soldiers their astonishing appearance. The hidden advantage that shaped their power awaits. It is a secret forged in factories, tested in jungles, and unleashed in the very battles that paved the road to Santo Tomas. And when it was revealed, it would explain why the Japanese were stunned, why the prisoners were awestruck, and why the war in the Pacific was destined to end in fire. The secret lay not in the size of their boots or the shine of their helmets, but in the invisible web that bound them together. From the jungles of Luzon to the beaches of Leyte, American forces carried with them something the Japanese neither anticipated nor understood: communication, coordination, and supply on a scale that seemed almost supernatural to their adversaries. What shocked the women at Santo Tomas was not only the height and health of the men, it was the aura of power that came from soldiers who never fought alone, never starved insolence, and never wandered without direction. Behind every rifleman stood an arsenal of technology, an army of engineers, and a nation's industry working in harmony. U.S. War Department Logistics Review, 1945. To understand the magnitude of this advantage, one must look beyond the battlefield to the humming factories of America. In Detroit, the Chrysler Arsenal plant roared day and night, rolling out Sherman tanks at a pace that defied belief. One completed every 30 minutes by 1942, an industrial feat that stunned visiting journalists. Detroit Arsenal Production Report, 1943. In Chicago, Motorola's engineers perfected the SCR 300 backpack radio, just 35 pounds, with a range of 5 miles in dense terrain. It was this device, born from the innovation of engineer Daniel Noble and his team, that gave U.S. infantry their invisible edge. For the first time in history, a platoon leader could talk directly to supporting artillery, armor, or aircraft. Orders no longer traveled by runner or flag. They crackled instantly through the humid air of the Pacific. Technical Manual TM11 to 242, 1943. The Japanese, by contrast, relied on outdated field telephones or shouted commands. Their officers often cut off in the chaos of battle. Captured diaries reveal their shock at American coordination. One officer, writing on Luzon in January 1945, confessed, "We attack in waves, but they always know where we are. The enemy guns open as though they see our hearts." Dramatized composite. Based on multiple captured diaries. Imperial Japanese Army POW interrogation. 1946. The hidden truth was not clairvoyance. It was radio. It was technology. It was the difference between silence and unity. But radios were only the beginning. The sheer volume of supplies that followed U.S. soldiers into battle was staggering. In February 1945, during the push into Manila, each American infantryman consumed on average 75 pounds of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, and medicine. Quartermaster General Report, 1946. To deliver this, the U.S. Army deployed Red Ball Express style logistics chains across Luzon, with trucks rumbling day and night over improvised roads. Even fresh bread reached the front lines, baked in mobile field ovens designed by quartermaster engineers. To starving prisoners watching crates of rations being unloaded, it was a revelation. The Americans carried not just life, but abundance. Weapons too bore the stamp of industrial mastery. The M1 Garand rifle, designed by Canadian-born engineer John C. Garand, fired 8 rounds semi-automatically at a rate unmatched by the Japanese Arisaka bolt action. At close range in the jungles, this rate of fire was decisive. An American squad, with its Garands and a Browning automatic rifle, could unleash a storm of lead that outmatched larger Japanese formations armed with slower rifles. Ordnance Department Field Evaluation. 1944. In the hands of tall, well-fed soldiers. The Garand became a symbol of unstoppable pressure. The technological gulf came to a head in one decisive action: the raid at Los Baños. February 23, 1945. This operation, often overshadowed by the larger battles in Manila, showcased the convergence of American firepower, communication, and audacity. At dawn, paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division, supported by Filipino guerrillas, descended near the internment camp where over 2,000 civilians were held. Coordination was flawless. C-47 aircraft roared overhead, dropping troopers directly on target, while guerrilla fighters struck the perimeter from the jungle. Inside the camp, the prisoners heard the impossible: shouts in English, parachutes blooming against the tropical sky. 11th Airborne Division Report, February 1945. Every element hinged on radios. As the paratroopers touched ground, SCR 300 sets crackled with updates, linking scattered groups into a single organism. Armored units advanced in concert. Artillery waited on standby, and trucks rolled in almost the instant the guards were subdued. Within minutes, the Japanese defenders, stunned and confused, were overwhelmed. Survivors later recalled the speed. It was as if the Americans had rehearsed every second of the assault. Dramatized composite survivor testimony. U.S. Army Oral History Project. 1946. In truth, they had rehearsed, not in the jungles, but in the doctrine of combined arms perfected since North Africa and Italy. Engineers and logisticians had ensured every piece of equipment could talk, move, and supply in synchronization. The raid freed 2,147 prisoners with only 2 paratroopers killed, an almost impossible ratio in the chaos of war. After action report, Los Baños Raid, 1945, for the Japanese, who often lost hundreds in frontal assaults against entrenched American lines. Such precision bordered on the unthinkable. Even the smallest details reflected the hidden advantage. When trucks evacuated the freed prisoners, many had not walked more than a few yards in years. Army medics distributed K-rations, each box containing biscuits, chocolate, powdered drink, cigarettes, and canned meat. To the emaciated captives, it was not food. It was civilization arriving in cardboard and waxed paper. One woman later wrote, "We could not believe such things still existed. It was like waking into another world." Civilian Internee Memoir, 1947. The shock extended to Japanese survivors of the raid. Interrogations revealed disbelief that Americans could coordinate paratroopers, armor, and guerrillas in one seamless strike. Their officers admitted they had never trained for such possibilities, bound as they were to rigid doctrine and lacking the radio sets that made such fluid operations possible. Japanese POW interrogation, March 1945, the raid, studied decades later by military academies, became a textbook example of how technology and coordination could achieve objectives far beyond the reach of brute force alone. The hidden advantage, then, was not merely radios or rifles, but the system that produced them. America's war effort was an engine of integration. From Daniel Noble's radio labs at Motorola to the sprawling Ford plants churning out trucks, every invention was designed to function as part of a greater whole. Soldiers in the jungle carried not just weapons, but the culmination of engineers, factory workers, logisticians, and planners. Each crate of supplies represented a line worker in Cleveland, each tank round a steel worker in Pittsburgh, and each radio a circuit soldered in Illinois. Office of War Production Report, 1945. This truth baffled Japanese officers, who were trained to believe in the supremacy of spirit over material. Bushido emphasized sacrifice, courage, and endurance. But against the Americans, they faced men who had spirit and material, who fought with courage but also with radios, rifles, rations, and a logistical arm that seemed infinite. No amount of bayonet charges could halt an enemy who could summon artillery in minutes or feed his men daily with hot meals. Imperial General Headquarters Memo, 1945. The women prisoners witnessed this firsthand. They saw soldiers who not only rescued them but also carried medicines for their sickness, food for their hunger, and even bandages sterilized and sealed in waxed packets. To them, these details seemed miraculous. To the Americans, they were standard issue. This gap in expectation revealed the true power of the hidden advantage. It was not simply overwhelming, it was normalized. The Americans fought as though abundance was natural, while their enemies struggled in scarcity. U.S. Army Nurse Corps Journal, 1945. And so, the shock deepened. The prisoners had expected men. They found an empire of men and machines, united. The Japanese had expected weakness. They found the embodiment of strength. The battlefield had shifted, not through courage alone, but through the marriage of courage with science, industry, and relentless supply. This union, invisible to the eye yet felt in every rifle shot and ration crate, was the true reason American soldiers seemed larger than life. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. But what was the cost of this advantage? How did it shape not just battles but the minds of those who fought, the morale of prisoners, and the despair of their captors? The psychological weight of America's system of war, the way it broke spirits as surely as it saved lives, would become the lasting legacy of the Pacific Campaign. And that legacy would ripple far beyond 1945, into the Cold War and beyond, where the question would linger: did victory belong to courage or to the machines that carried it? The liberation of the camps was not only a military act, it was psychological warfare delivered in flesh and steel. When the gates of Santo Tomas and Los Baños burst open, the balance of perception in the Pacific shifted. For the prisoners, the sight of robust American soldiers carrying rations, radios, and medicine was salvation. For the Japanese, it was humiliation, the shattering of years of propaganda. And for the soldiers themselves, it was confirmation of something deeper, that the vast machine of war behind them, the factories, the engineers, the workers back home, was as decisive as the bullets in their rifles. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The impact spread quickly across the Philippines. Within days of the Los Baños Raid, Allied newspapers declared it one of the most daring rescues of the war. Families back home, reading accounts of women and children freed from captivity, felt pride swell into resolve. The morale effect was incalculable. Soldiers who had slogged through jungle mud for months suddenly saw tangible proof of why they fought. Not just islands or airfields, but lives reclaimed from the grip of despair. Stars and Stripes, March 1945. In contrast, Japanese reports from the same period reveal a collapse of confidence. Officers lamented that their men no longer believed victory possible. As one captured lieutenant confessed, they arrive with food, weapons, and strength. We arrive with nothing but courage. Courage cannot feed us. Dramatized composite based on multiple interrogations. Imperial Japanese Army POW interrogation, 1946. The psychological shock went beyond the battlefield. For prisoners, the sudden flood of abundance, canned meat, chocolate bars, powdered milk, was disorienting. Medical officers recorded cases where starved internees wept at the taste of chocolate after years of rice husks and boiled weeds. U.S. Army Medical Corps report, 1945. To them, these were not just calories but symbols of a civilization that had seemed lost. Nurses and doctors among the prisoners marveled at the supplies of penicillin and sulfa drugs, life-saving medicines unavailable for years. The message was clear. America had not only the will to fight but also the capacity to sustain life on an industrial scale. For the Japanese, the opposite message emerged. Their doctrine of spiritual strength faltered when confronted by the relentless tide of American logistics. The Imperial Army had always emphasized sacrifice as the ultimate weapon, bonsai charges, kamikaze missions, and starvation endurance. Yet, as one Japanese colonel admitted in a post-war interrogation, our spirit was strong, but the enemy's material was endless. Spirit can hold a hill for a day. Trucks and radios hold it forever. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. In this clash of worldviews, the camp liberations became proof that war in the 20th century belonged not to individual courage alone, but to the fusion of courage with machines. The engineers and workers who enabled this edge deserve as much recognition as the soldiers on the front lines. In Illinois, Motorola's radio teams worked 18-hour shifts, refining circuits that could withstand jungle humidity. In Michigan, women riveters at the Ford plant turned out trucks by the thousands, each one destined to carry rations or wounded men across the Philippines. In New Jersey, pharmaceutical plants scaled up penicillin production so that even liberated prisoners could receive doses once reserved only for generals. Office of War Production Report, 1945. Every GI who marched into a camp carried the labor of millions. This was industrial democracy at war, a nation of citizens contributing, knowingly or not, to the moment when barbed wire would fall. Strategically, the effect was immense. The liberation of civilians and POWs reinforced General MacArthur's narrative of righteous conquest. It strengthened support for the continuation of the Pacific Campaign, even as casualty lists from Iwo Jima and Okinawa shocked the American public. The image of gaunt prisoners embracing healthy soldiers was broadcast worldwide, a moral counterpoint to the horrors of Japanese atrocities. MacArthur Military History Series, Volume 5, in Washington. Policymakers recognized the propaganda value. Every camp freed became a rallying cry that justified the enormous cost of island hopping. The Japanese, by contrast, saw their control unravel. Once civilians were freed, their testimony spread rapidly, undermining Tokyo's narrative of benevolent occupation. Prisoners spoke of starvation, beatings, and neglect. International Red Cross reports, long suppressed, confirmed the accounts. The loss of psychological dominance was as lethal as the loss of territory. Japanese soldiers began to desert in greater numbers, doubting the cause they had been taught was divine. International Red Cross report, 1946. The empire's myth of invincibility crumbled not only under bombs but also under the gaze of women who had survived their cruelty and now spoke openly of it. Yet the cost was not absent. American abundance was achieved by sacrifice on the home front. Rationing of gasoline, rubber, and food, endless overtime in factories, and the grief of families who lost sons in distant jungles. The same convoys that delivered rations to freed prisoners carried the coffins of men killed securing the roads. For every radio set carried into the jungle, there was an engineer who worried if it would fail under fire. For every tank that rolled off an assembly line, there was a welder who knew a mistake could cost lives. Victory was built not on miracles, but on relentless human labor, stretched across continents. War Production Board Final Report, 1946. The legacy of this hidden advantage endured long after 1945. In the early Cold War, the U.S. military embraced the lesson that connectivity and logistics were decisive. Korea saw the use of mobile radio networks on an even larger scale. Vietnam brought helicopters as airborne lifelines, echoing the convoys of Luzon. In the Gulf War, satellite communications and precision-guided munitions extended the same principle, that the side that connects its forces and sustains them wins before the battle begins. Department of Defense Analysis, 1991. The shadow of the Pacific lingered in every war game and every doctrine. Abundance, coordination, and speed outweighed mere courage for the survivors of the camps. The memory of that moment never faded. Interviews decades later reveal the same words: giants, angels, saviors. Yet the soldiers themselves, when asked, spoke modestly. Many insisted they had simply done their duty, following orders into the mud. What they did not always realize was how their appearance, tall, clean, radiating vitality, had become a weapon in itself. They were symbols of a world that valued life, of a nation capable of rescuing its own. U.S. Army Oral History Project, 1972. In the end, the liberation of Japanese-held camps was not just the end of captivity. It was a revelation of modern war's essence. Battles were fought with bullets and bayonets, but wars were won with radios, rations, and the relentless pulse of industry. The women who looked upon their liberators saw more than men in uniform. They saw the embodiment of a system, compromise, and a nation's will manifested in flesh and steel. The Japanese saw it too, and knew in that instant that their empire, already bleeding, had no hope of matching it. Imperial Japanese General Staff Debrief, 1946. One prisoner, recalling her first sight of the soldiers, summed it up decades later. They were so strong, so alive. We thought they had come from another world. But they were ours. They had come for us. Civilian Internee Memoir, 1968. And so, history closed upon a truth written in mud and wire. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats endurance. The appearance of those American soldiers in the camps was not merely physical. It was the visible form of an invisible empire of supply and science. It was the face of victory and the beginning of the end.